In this tutorial, I'm going to go through the second tab in your NetBow Online account, which is this Properties tab. Underneath, there's this Pastures drop-down and an Animal Profiles drop-down. And both of these things are required. You have to have a pasture and animal profile to submit a NetBow sample, so they're good things to just kind of enter as you're getting ready to start using NetBow and characterizing your property. And to refer back to our getting started with NetBow Online tutorial, properties are geographically different locations that you might be managing. So they're not the different pastures on one ranch of yours, but they might be several different ranches that you manage. Pasture and animal profiles allow you to enter specific and generally unchanging information about your pastures or your animal groups on your property. And these things are, again, they will probably not be changing, so you'll be able to reuse them from sample to sample. Because when you submit a fecal sample, that fecal sample is going to be associated with both a pasture and at least one animal profile. If this is your first time to create a pasture for this property, when you go to the Pastures page, you'll see your Google Maps with your property location with this red icon that represents your property address that you've put in the property details drop-down. In order to create a pasture, you just need to click a point on the map and it'll put a green drop-down, and that represents where your pasture location is going to be. And so you can adjust it if you would like to get an accurate representation. Then you would fill out this information below to describe the pasture. And so you'd give it a name and just a little description. And so the size of grazable area refers to maybe not necessarily the size of your pasture, though if all of it is 100% accessible, then yes, you would do the whole pasture size. But if part of your pasture is covered by a tank or by a pond, or maybe there's part of it that's just extremely rocky or steep and your animals won't be able to utilize that, then you would want to adjust the area of your pasture accordingly to represent where there would be forage for them to graze. And harvest use efficiency represent the amount of forage that you're going to allow them to remove from the pasture before you move them into another pasture. And these two numbers, the size of the grazable area and harvest use efficiency, are used to calculate the stocking rate for that pasture and forage availability as well. Vegetation cover is also used for forage availability. We use these values to predict vegetation growth. And so we have 5 options: improved pasture, tall grass, intermediate grass, short grass, these different native options, and then an annual grain. And so you would just want to pick the one that best represents your area. And then for activity terrain, we have kind of a big drop-down list of selections, but what this is actually representing is the energy requirements of your animals in the performance prediction. So if they're having to travel a lot to get water or traverse steep or rocky hills, those are going to increase energy requirements, and you would want to choose accordingly. In all honesty though, this adequately watered options and these poorly watered options with the 2 different slope descriptions are going to be the ones that are most commonly used and that we recommend using. The rest of these are a little more technical. You'll also see that we have a confinement option, and we know that a lot of cattle, especially for our clients up north, are going to be confined and fed in a feedlot situation over the winter. I actually don't recommend selecting this option because what it will do is it will automatically assume when you are submitting a sample and doing an animal performance projection that all of the nutrients in the animal's diet are going to be contributed from feeds that we'll add to sample description, and we'll get into that in the next tutorial. But what it will cause the model to do is to completely disregard the information from the fecal NIRS scan. So if they are in confinement all winter, but they have free access to hay and that's mostly what they're consuming, it's a forage diet just like they would be grazing, but instead it's hay. It's just as good to put them in these adequately watered pastures. If you are feeding a set amount of hay, in your sample description, you can describe that either on the sample sheet, we have a comments section, or in the pasture section of the sample description online. You can describe how much hay that they're getting, and after the performance report has been produced on our end, we can then adjust the intake to match that amount. So once all this is entered, you'll see this latitude and longitude is automatically filled out based on where you've dropped this pin. So you'd want to hit save to commit everything to your account. So I've changed properties to a ranch that has already had some samples and pastures made. It has a little bit of sample history. So you could edit or move this pasture, hit save, but you aren't going to be able to delete this pasture because it's already associated with a sample. So make sure before you submit a sample and describe that pasture that is all the correct information, or the correct way you would like to describe that pasture, because you won't be able to delete it after that sample has been processed. Another thing, so let's say you're making edits and you forget to hit save, but then you click on another link or another pasture, you will get a little pop-up that reminds you to save the changes to that pasture. One common issue we have with creating pastures is forgetting to place an icon on the map before you start entering this information. So right now it says new pasture. This is all blank, so none of these icons have been selected. And I am going to make a new pasture. And so all of this has been filled out except the latitude and longitude aren't appearing, and that's because there was never an icon put down on the map. Because there was never an icon on the map, you can't save this pasture. You can hit save, it will stay there, but as soon as you click on a different link or click on a pasture, that information all goes away and you would have to re-enter it to make that new pasture. So let's put that down, and then again you'd go through these steps and hit save, and it would be saved there and you'd be able to move from pasture to pasture. So now that we've created pastures, we can move on to animal profiles. And animal profiles are, again, similar to these pastures where they can be reused. They represent a part of your ranch that is going to be consistent, or that multiple samples will represent, and it just gives you the ability to track those samples over time and group them by the animal profiles. Another thing about animal profiles is that when you create a sample, you can attach several profiles to that sample. So if you have a herd that is a wide variety of different types of cattle, maybe in terms of breed, maybe in terms of age, stage of reproduction, you would be able to create different profiles for those different groups and add them under a sample description. And the idea behind that is that these different types or characterizations of animals, they represent animals that have different nutritional requirements and that will perform differently even though they're all on the same diet. Right now, there's this table up here, and all you can see is that no profiles have been added. So if you're just starting out with your account, you'll need to create profiles. So to start, you would go down to this bottom section below this red bar, and it's already ready for you to create a new profile. So all you have to do is start describing them. So let's just start with a little heifer profile. So you would describe that profile, or if you have a consistent name or reference that you use for that group. Then you would select their gender. So we have quite a few breeds, so you're going to want to find the breed that represents this profile. And let's say if you have a breed cross that's not represented on this list, you can go to these advanced options. So if you have a specific cross that you would like to describe, you can change these percentages of the different types of breeds, so dairy, dual purpose, continental, and tropical breeds. You can also adjust your frame score. NetBio Online will automatically produce a frame score based on this animal breed that we have in our system. We have a breeds library that it pulls kind of these standard values from. But they're all adjustable, but of course you don't have to adjust them. It might make things more complicated, or you might prefer to go with the default options, and that's totally fine. You would put in the number of head that you have in that group of animals, so specifically this age group. And then you would put in their birth date in terms of year and month. So once you've put in all of this information, you will hit Save Profile, and that's a very important key to all of this, hitting the Save button. And once you have this brown bar with this profile information and a unique profile number will appear in this table. You want to make sure this bar appears. That means that it was saved and it's in your system. And you can go back and edit some of this information. So let's go to that other property. So this property has some sample history. Again, this is the one we looked at the pastures a few minutes ago. And so as you can see, there's already profiles here. And if I just went straight to this page, I would have the opportunity to create a new profile right off the bat. Once I started clicking on different profiles, to make a new profile, you would go, and even though there's information here, you would just hit clear fields, and it's not going to be a big deal because it's going to just assume that you're now creating a new profile. So you're not deleting or removing information by hitting this clear fields button. If you click on a profile that already has a sample associated with it, you'll see this warning sign. And if you were to edit any of this information, particularly the birth date, that will affect this sample, and you'd have to go rerun that case to get an updated performance value for the different requirements associated with that age difference. So we generally recommend not editing profiles after you've started submitting samples with them. When you're thinking about the composition of your herd, things to take into consideration if you're submitting a sample with a variety of animals, again, would be the age, breed, and stage of reproduction. And so a couple things that we see sometimes is different ages. Our NetBio model is sensitive to basically month-by-month differences for cattle under the age of 5. So if you have any cattle that are below 60 months, below 5 years, and are spread out, so if you have a herd that might have 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds, you would want to create a profile for a 2-year-old aged animal, a 3-year-old aged animal, and a 5-year-old aged animal. However, if you have a herd of old cows that are all above 5 years old, that's a group that you could group together and just use their average age. Another thing that you might consider doing is if you have animals that, or a herd of cows that are starting to calve, so you have some that are in the late stages of gestation and some are in the early stages of lactation. Even if they are the same age, you might consider making different profiles for those different groups because they're going to have different requirements as well. Or you could just make a profile for the early lactating cows, as that's going to be your group with the higher animal requirements, and of course eventually your late gestation cows will be early lactation cows. So if they happen to calve over the 30-day prediction of the sample, the early lactating values might be more relevant for that group. And finally, if you have calves on the ground that are still nursing, we ask that you don't create a profile for those animals. So our nutbell performance model was designed for animals that were over the age of 6 months and that are no longer nursing. Because our fecal NRS analysis is designed for determining forage diet quality, if they're still nursing, that will affect the quality of that scan, and it will also affect some different factors in the performance projections in terms of determining forage intake and overall diet quality. So now that you've had your pastures and animal profiles, you'll be able to create a sample description. And going through the sample description will actually be our next tutorial. So stay tuned for that, and thanks for listening. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to call or email us, and we'd be happy to help you.